Welcome back to the Datsun 280z teardown. After about a month of having the engine and transmission out of the car, finally had some time to get back into working on the engine bay and the front half of the vehicle. So most of this first maybe quarter of the video is going to be just taking off and detaching different parts in the engine bay. So different electrical tie downs, things that hold the cables in place in the engine bay, as well as different components in the engine bay that are actually mounted. So working on the driver's side a little bit, looking under the inspection lids here in a moment, and getting the wiper blades off, trying to figure out how to get that cowl off eventually. Turns out there's double-sided adhesive. I had to do a little Google searching to realize that, and essentially what I ended up doing is you lift the front side of the cowl, you get a long flathead screwdriver, and what worked for me at least was essentially just poking and prodding to essentially destroy that double-sided adhesive, and that finally released it once I got the different bolts off. So I don't think you can actually do that without taking the quarter panels off. That'll be coming up here later in the video. What I'm doing there, you can see I'm labeling everything. So I used a lot of painter's tape and Sharpie for the wiring. Now, with the setup that I'm going with, I will probably not need most of the wiring anymore. But if I do, I wanted to mark everything and make sure I knew exactly where it went and how it connected. So lots of labeling taking place in case I need to get back to that original state. Here you can see just taking off some of the stuff on the driver's side wheel well and cleaning up some of the different parts there. Trying to figure out how the cable is actually routed. I think I'm taking off the little horns in the front there in the bumper. The bumper is still on. It's a little out of shot. You can kind of see the front corners of it, but the front bumper is still on, so that made some of the work in the front end a little challenging at this point. So I didn't get super far with this and just had a little bit of time. Fast forward a couple months, work got super busy and I was on the road a lot. So we're now in September of 2018 and I decided to get the front bumper off so that I could have a lot more access to that front area of the vehicle. So I ended up doing this one person. You can do it. You definitely need something. I just used a big heavy cooler and some 2x4s to hold it in place so it doesn't just fall off and put tension on some of the bolts that are holding it in place. It worked out pretty well. Took probably a little bit longer with one person than it would with two, but overall very happy with how it went. For being a 40-plus-year-old car, the rubber is actually relatively okay, although you can see in front of the right driver headlight it is cracked and there's a chunk missing. I know a lot of people put 240Z bumpers on this. I still don't know what I'm going to do. I really don't like the look of, you can see it closer there, the rubber that is cracked and part of it that is missing. I really don't like the look of that. I honestly don't mind the big bumper, but apparently the rubber pieces there are nearly impossible to find complete. So I'm not really sure what is going to happen to the bumper situation. That is something I can figure out later on down the road. Here I'm just taking the front grille off, again just to get some more easy access to some of the different bolts that are holding the bumper shocks and the bumper itself in place. You can see one at maybe at the top middle of the screen going horizontally, and there it's shifting, and I think I got most of the bolts out. And just with the way that the metal is formed, right here you can kind of see you have to twist it a little bit, change the angle to get the mount out of the body, and I ended up loosening up, like you saw there, some of the inside ones just to give it enough play where I could move it around. So again, nothing too challenging or crazy, just it's a pretty heavy bumper to handle with one person. So definitely gonna need some supports if you're going to do that by yourself. And moving on, I took off the front turn signals, turns out not to be too hard at all. Some of the screws or bolts were a bit rusty, so I'll probably have to replace those. You can see I'm trying to work the wiring and all the harnesses around back into the main body so I can eventually take those off and completely get them out of the car. There's two harnesses. One comes through the driver's side, one through the passenger side firewall, and you got to be a little careful pulling them in and out. I can't remember which way you do it exactly, but it'll be pretty obvious. It'll only work one way to completely disconnect it. Again, I'm not going to be using this wiring harness again. I'll probably make a new one just for the challenge, and I won't need a lot of the stuff. I'm going to try to update some of it, and one of the things I'm going for is a clean engine bay. So definitely going to work on cable routing and minimizing unnecessary cables for the build that I'm doing. Here I'm moving on to the front quarter panel. Again, this is the first time I've done any of this stuff, so taking it slow takes a little bit longer on this first one, trying to figure out where all the attachment points are, how it's connected. Here you can see there's one that's kind of behind the door or under the door or just in front of the door, but it was still accessible looking inside. Again, trying to figure out where all the different tie downs are. All the obvious ones I took off earlier are just the ones right where the hood gap is, and then from there it's just all the extra ones that are supporting it. I had a heck of a time finding the last one that seemed to be holding it down, and I think I probably ended up taking off a couple of bolts that weren't specifically necessary to do it, but I'd be really curious to see, for those of you watching who have done it before, do you typically disconnect the headlight bucket first? Do you take that off all as one piece? You can see here trying to get under the headlight bucket and figure out where that's mounted so I can take it off all as one piece. If there's an easier way to do it, let me know in the comments. Here we're just taking off the dust liner, mud liner, whatever you want to call it, on the interior of the quarter panel over the wheel well, or essentially is the wheel well, and that pretty much wraps up the driver's side. Knowing where all the bolts are is huge and made the passenger side significantly easier and quicker. Still dealt with some of the same stuff, right? Just some of the bolts are harder to get to than others. Some of the ones on the bottom side are right near seams, metal seams, and where they're just pushed together, not specifically welded, and at least on my car. And so I ended up having to, bang some of the some of that sheet metal back away from the head of the bolt so that I could actually get the wrench or the socket in there to release it. Here I'm starting on the front and getting rid of some of the obvious ones. So these are the ones I was talking about earlier, right on the hood seam. Super easy and straightforward if they're not rusted, seized, or snapped. Luckily, that was not the case with those. They weren't all easy, but none of them were egregiously rusted or broken. So that made it relatively straightforward on the passenger side. Again, moving on to some of the other bolts that are only accessible underneath the body to get that quarter panel off. The biggest problem really with these quarter panels is not that they are hard to get off necessarily. It's just that they're big and unwieldy and you really don't want to damage them. So you got to make sure that you have something to store them in and keep them safe so they're not going to get dinged up and bent and mangled during storage. Luckily I have a pretty decent sized garage, had a couple of boxes. You can see there I'm putting them in, and they ended up going on a shelf out of the way and protected. So shouldn't have any concerns there, at least for the time being, until I run out of storage and need to start moving stuff around again, which we're quickly approaching, and the wife wants her garage stall back. So at this point, I was still being pretty diligent about any time I was done, keeping that far stall to the left that you see open by the end of the night, so she could park her car there. Right now, it's probably in real time, January 2019. It's been It's probably been about a month since that has been possible, since we're moving on to some of the stuff that takes just a little bit more space and you need some more tools out and accessible at one point.